The outermost whorl of the flower, that is the first whorl, is the calyx. It is a green leafy structure, and each one is known as the sepals. That is, the sepals are collectively called the calyx. Now this calyx, it helps to protect the flower in the bud condition. Here is the flower in the bud condition. It is protecting the flower in the bud condition, that is before the flower has opened. It is a green in color, therefore it also helps in photosynthesis. The second whorl after the calyx is the corolla. It is made up of petals. Usually the corolla is colored, very brightly colored. The corolla are actually modified leaves. They protect the inner walls of the flower and also help in pollination because of their bright color. The insects are attracted by the bright color, and indirectly they come for nectar to the flower, and indirectly they help in what is known as pollination. 80% of the pollination is brought about by insects. Androecium. Androecium is the male part of a flower. It is the third whorl. Its members are called stamen. Generally, the number of stamens will depend upon the number of petals. That is, if there are 4 petals, there will be 4 stamens. Now, if you look at a stamen, it has a long, slender stalk which is called the filament. And at the tip of the stalk is the anther, which has got 2 lobes. And if the anther is cut open, we'll find that it contains 4 pollen sacs where pollen grains are produced. And when these pollen grains mature, the pollen sacs burst, and there are on this anther, there are pores, and the pollen grains will come and rest on the anther. That is why when we touch the anther, we get some dust on our fingers, which is nothing but the pollen grain. Now, at the tip of the stamen, there are nectaries. That is that sweet liquid which insects come. But when they come to get the nectar, in return, their legs are covered with pollen grain. So when they visit another flower, the pollen grain will stick to the stigma and they help in what is known as pollination. And once it goes onto the stigma, the pollen grain, we will find that a pollen tube will be produced, that is, germination will start. But over here, remember, it is very important that the pollen grains have to be of the same species. That is, mango plant flower, the insect has to visit only mango plant flower. If it goes to a jackfruit plant flower, it will not happen. So fertilization or pollination will be successful only if the pollen grains are of the same species. The last whorl of the flower is the gynoecium. It produces the female gametes. It is the innermost whorl of the flower and is surrounded by the male whorl, that is the stamens, or we can say the androecium. Now each unit of the gynoecium is called the carpel. The carpel is made up of the ovary, which is at the base, the style, and the stigma. Now this stigma is shallow and it is sticky because the pollen grains have to get stuck over here. Then you have this style which is a hollow tube, and the pollen tube has to pass through it to reach the ovary. The ovary contains ovules. Now these ovules will form the seed of the fruit, and the ovary will form the fruit. Now these ovules, their number varies. Now in the case of mango, wheat, rice, you have just one seed. That means there is only one ovule. But in the case of papaya, in the case of watermelon, there are many seeds. That means there are many ovules. As you know, pollen grain is the male reproductive part of the flower. Pollen grains are microscopic, unicellular. They vary in shape and size, but usually they are oval or spherical. We cannot see them with our naked eyes because they appear like dust. This is the structure of a pollen grain as seen under an electron microscope. Now we have already discussed about the androecium. That is the male part of the flower, the third whorl. It is made up of stamens. A stamen has a filament, and at the tip it has the anther, which are present in two lobes. And if we cut open this anther, we'll find that there are 4 pollen sacs. And these pollen sacs, they produce the pollen grain. Now when these pollen grains mature, the sac bursts open and the pollen grains are released. Now if we touch this pollen sac, you know that our hand is covered with a yellow, orangish yellow powder, that is the pollen. Now if you look at the pollen, a mature pollen, it has 2 walls. It is double walled. The outer wall is very tough and it protects the pollen and has got pores. The inner wall will help in the formation of the pollen tube. You have not heard of pollen tube before, but as we are discussing and we come to the end of fertilization, you will understand what is the pollen tube. The central part contains the cytoplasm. Now this will keep the pollen grain moist and alive. Inside the cytoplasm, you will find that there is the tube cell, which is also known as the vegetative cell. It is large in size and it contains abundant food reserve, which is needed for it during the formation of the pollen tube. And you have a small cell over here, which is known as the generative cell. To form the pollen tube and the male gametes, the stigma, that is the female part of the flower, has to capture the pollen grain. The pollen grain will land on the stigma with the help of wind, water, insects, birds or bats. They are the agents of pollination. The stigma being sticky, the pollen grains get stuck to it and start germinating, meaning they will start producing the pollen tube. And this pollen tube will emerge from those pores. I told you there are pores, so it will emerge from one of the pores. Now, the tube nucleus will, the tube cell will enter the pollen tube, and also the generative cells will enter the pollen tube. Now for the growth of the pollen tube, you require food, you require energy. All this is there with the tube cell. Also for the generative cell to divide meiotically into two haploid male gametes, all the nourishment is supplied by the tube cell. So it follows the path. It's right in the front like this. It's in the front and followed by the two haploid male gametes. Now see, the tube keeps on growing longer and longer till it reaches the ovule where fertilization will take place. Once the pollen grains, the pollen tube reaches its destination, the tube cell will just disintegrate because its work is done. Now how fertilization takes place, I will explain in the next video. A little while back, we discussed the structure of the gynecium. The unit of the gynecium is called a carpel. It is made up of the stigma, the style and the ovary. And inside the ovary, there are ovules. Now, we will be discussing the structure of a single ovule. Now, this ovule is attached to the style by a stalk. It is made up of a two-layered tissue. Over here is an opening which is known as a micropyle, and the pollen tube will enter the ovule through the micropyle and release the male gametes. Only then will fertilization take place. Now inside this there is the nucleus and there is a megaspore which is also known as the mother cell. Now this mother cell or megaspore will undergo meiotic division. It undergoes meiosis, and from that mother cell you will get 4 haploid cells. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 haploid cells. Now the haploid cells, only one will be functional, the other by default will be non-functional and they will degenerate. Now as soon as this meiotic division takes place, this is no more an ovule. Now it is called the embryo sac. That means the ovule has converted or changed into the embryo sac. I just told you that the mother cell divides into 4 haploid cells. Out of them, only one is functional, the other 3 are non-functional, they will disintegrate. Now this single functional cell undergoes 3 mitotic divisions which will result in 8 nuclei. Now when I said they divide mitotically, there is only nuclear division, no cytoplasmic division. Now these nuclei, they form a wall which is very distinct and they differentiate into cells of the embryo sac. Out of these 8, 3 are very close to the micropyle, 2 are in the center and 3 are opposite the micropyle. Now these 2 over here are known as the synagrid cells. The center is the egg cell. Then over here in the center is the central cell, which is very large. It is a single cell which contains two nuclei, and opposite the micropyle we have three cells which are known as the antipodal cells. So I said 7 cells with 8 nuclei. So here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So these are the 7 cells with 8 nuclei. Now the synergid cells, which are at the micropyle end, that is at the opening of the ovule, and they are one on each side of the egg cell. Now what do? They attract the pollen tube. When it reaches here, they stop its growth, they rupture it, and they release the male gametes. The antipodal cells are 3. They are very active cells. They transfer nutrients and hormones to the egg and the central cell, and then it disintegrates. When the pollen grain lands on the stigma of the flower of the correct species, that means if the pollen grain is of a mango flower, it has to land on the stigma of the mango flower only. When the species is correct, then the pollen grain starts producing a pollen tube in the hollow style, and this pollen tube will keep growing till it reaches the micropyle, that is the pore which is there on the ovule. Now once it reaches the micropyle, the synergid cells, what they will do? They will start their function. That is, they will attract the pollen tube towards themselves, they will stop it from growing, and they will rupture it. Now when they rupture it, it releases the male gametes. Now we will look at it in this picture, what happens once the male gametes are released. Now the synergid cells have finished their job, they will disintegrate, they will disappear. Now one of the male gametes will unite with the egg cell, and this will form the zygote. That is, the egg cell plus the male gamete will form the zygote. Now there are 2 nucleus in the zygote, so it is called diploid nucleus, and this zygote will go to form the embryo. Now coming back to what is this embryo? This embryo will grow, it will differentiate and become the plant with the roots, the leaves and the stem, and ultimately it will become an adult plant. Now the other gamete, it will go and fuse with the central cell, and what will form is a triploid nucleus. 2 nuclei of the central cell and 1 nuclei of the male gamete will give you a triploid nucleus. Now this will form what is known as the endosperm, that is the nutritive tissue inside the seed. It accumulates all the nutrients from the mother plant and stores them away for the developing embryo inside the seed. Since 2 fertilizations are taking place, the first one, egg plus male gamete, gives rise to the zygote, and the second one is the central cell plus the male gamete gives rise to the endosperm. Fertilization over here is called double fertilization. Once fertilization is complete, the ovary swells to form the fruits and the ovules form the seeds. Now we all know that fruits are eaten and the seeds are thrown or they lie here and there. Now seeds need protection. Therefore they have a seed coat to protect the inner delicate embryo during unfavorable condition. When the seeds are sown in the soil and they achieve favorable conditions, they give rise to a new plant. Actually, I never